Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going to completely demystify rotational motion. We'll be taking concepts you probably already know like the back of your hand, things like force and mass, and mapping them directly onto the totally fascinating mechanics of objects that spin, roll, and tumble.
Okay, let's kick things off with a bit of a mystery. Picture an inclined plane, just a standard ramp. Now, imagine 5 differently shaped objects lined up right at the top. They are all released from rest at the exact same fraction of a second. So, what do you think? Which shape actually reaches the bottom first?
Let's meet our competitors. We've got a hollow sphere, kind of like an empty basketball. A solid sphere, think of a heavy iron cannonball. A hollow cylinder, like a piece of PVC pipe. A solid cylinder, maybe like a dense mechanical roller. And finally, a perfectly frictionless cube, which is just going to slide down the ramp like it's gliding on a freshly Zambonied ice rink. Now, all of these objects have the exact same mass and the exact same size. But to actually figure out the winner, we can't just guess. We're going to use some clear diagrams and formulas to break down the physics of how they move, which really makes these complex concepts incredibly simple to understand.
Before we place our bets on the race, we need to cover one foundational rule, the concept of a rigid body. This literally just means that the distance between any 2 points inside the object stays completely constant, no matter how hard you push or pull it. Basically, the objects we're studying won't bend, they won't stretch, and they definitely won't squish as they head down the ramp. And that physical constraint is a lifesaver because it lets us mathematically predict their motion without having to calculate a bunch of random bouncing and deforming.
If we look at this textbook diagram, it brilliantly illustrates this point. Notice how, whether the body is moving in straight-line rectilinear translation or curving wildly through space, that internal dotted line between point A and point B, it stays perfectly locked in its length. The distance doesn't change one bit. That visual proof is the absolute bedrock for predicting exactly what our shapes are going to do.
To crack the case of our ramp race, we're going to build a really helpful analogy. We'll compare standard linear motion, where a whole object just shifts together in a straight line, to rotational motion, where an object actually turns around a fixed axis. We're going to map standard linear variables like velocity v and force F straight onto their rotational twins. By mapping straight lines to circles, this whole puzzle suddenly becomes so much easier to visualize.
Let's start with linear motion. If our rigid body simply translates in a straight line, every single microscopic particle inside it perfectly mirrors the exact same movement. Every point goes in the exact same direction by the exact same distance. An internal straight line, like that A to B line we just looked at, will always stay perfectly parallel to where it started. Zero twisting. And actually, this is exactly what our frictionless cube is going to do as it slides down the incline. But rotational motion? That's a totally different beast. Instead of shifting together, the body spins around a fixed axis. And here's the catch. While the object as a whole shares the same overall angular velocity, the individual points inside it are traveling in their own distinct little circles. So if you were tracing that same internal line from A to B now, you'd see its orientation spinning in space. It definitely doesn't stay parallel.
So what about rolling? Well, rolling is actually a mashup of both. The center of mass translates forward in a neat straight line, that's the linear part, while the rest of the object continuously rotates around that moving center. They are translating forward and turning at the exact same time. And this brilliantly explains why our spheres and cylinders rolling down the ramp are mechanically so much more complex than the sliding cube.
Now, if the movement makes sense, let's talk about the force that actually sparks that rotation. Say hello to torque. Represented by the Greek letter tau, torque is quite simply the turning effect of a force on a rigid body around an axis. Just like a regular linear force causes linear acceleration, torque is the secret sauce that causes angular acceleration. Let's make this super intuitive. Think about opening a massive, solid wood door. If you try pushing it open right smack next to the hinges, you're going to be sweating, right? It barely moves. But if you push from the handle at the far edge, it swings open without a second thought. The actual turning effect is vastly different depending on where you push, even if you're using the exact same amount of muscle. Because of that, torque really boils down to 3 specific ingredients. First, the actual amount of force you apply, F. Second, your distance from the axis of rotation, the position vector R. And third, the angle of your push. I mean, if you push straight into the edge of a door, it doesn't open, right? You need the right angle. You literally need all 3 of these to calculate the turning effect.
Let's look at a visual to really nail this down. See the pivot point there at the origin O? Notice how the position vector R extends outward like a lever arm right to where the force F connects. The angle theta directly between them is what dictates how much of your force is actually doing the turning. In physics, we only care about the component of your force that is perfectly perpendicular to that lever arm.
Which brings us to this beautifully simple formula. Torque equals R times F times the sine of theta. This math is exactly what proves our door analogy. To get the maximum possible turning force, you want a really big R, meaning you push as far from the hinge as possible, and you want a perfect angle. 90 degrees is the golden ticket, because the sine of 90 is 1. That means 100% of your effort is converted into pure rotational power.
And hey, this formula also explains why pushing directly at the hinge is totally useless. If you apply force right at the axis, your distance r is 0. Or, if you push perfectly parallel to the door, your angle is 0. And since the sine of 0 is 0, 0 times anything leaves you with 0 torque. All sweat, 0 spin. Just a quick housekeeping note. Since things can obviously spin in two different directions, physicists use a standard convention to keep the math from getting messy. An anti-clockwise rotation is labeled as positive torque, and a clockwise rotation is negative torque. It just makes it way easier to add up multiple forces on a single spinning object without losing your mind in the equations.
Okay, so if torque is the push, what exactly is pushing back? Meet the moment of inertia, marked by the letter I. This is literally the rotational equivalent of mass. You know how a heavy object is hard to push in a straight line? Well, an object with a high moment of inertia is incredibly stubborn when you try to spin it. Imagine a playground merry-go-round packed with kids versus an empty one. How that mass is distributed completely changes how hard you have to push.
And this brings us to the ultimate comparison, tying everything we've talked about together. It's the exact same fundamental relationship. We're just swapping out straight lines for circles. Linear force becomes torque, mass becomes the moment of inertia, and linear acceleration turns into angular acceleration. It is quite literally Newton's second law, entirely translated for a spinning world.
So, armed with the visual mechanics of rigid bodies, our formulas for torque, and this beautifully simple rotational version of Newton's second law, you now have everything you need to figure out which of our 5 shapes will win the ramp race. Here is the secret. Because our hollow and solid shapes are built differently, their mass is distributed completely differently around their axis of rotation. That means they all have a vastly different moment of inertia. So, I leave you with this to chew on. If a higher moment of inertia means more resistance to spinning, which of our competitors is going to stubbornly lag behind, and which one has the perfect internal mass distribution to speed past the rest and take the gold?